The first board came loose easier than it should have. Jester wrapped his small fingers around the edge of a rotting plank that had partially separated from the cabin's north wall, where the wind cut through like a blade. He'd been studying the damage for hours, trying to understand how Pa's old hammer could help him fix what looked unfixable. The wood was grey and splintered, warped from 50 Montana winters, but when he pulled, gently the way he'd seen Pa test fence posts back when Pa still cared about such things, the nails slid free with barely a creak. That was the first strange thing. The second was finding the cache of tools. Behind where the loose board had been, tucked into a gap between the cabin's inner and outer walls, Jester discovered a leather pouch wrapped in oiled canvas. Inside, a small saw with teeth still sharp enough to cut, a square for measuring right angles, a handful of iron nails that showed no rust, and a piece of charcoal perfect for marking wood. Jester's breath misted in the frigid air as he laid the tools on the cabin's tilted floor. Pa had left him with only that rusted hammer, told him it was all a worthless boy deserved, but here was everything he needed to make real repairs. The leather was soft and supple, as if it hadn't spent decades frozen in these walls. The metal gleamed dull silver in the weak afternoon light filtering through the broken roof. "Must have been the prospectors," Jester whispered to himself, though his voice sounded strange in the empty cabin. Too loud, like the walls were listening. He'd heard the stories about Thomas Whitmore from the older boys in Bitter Creek, how the crazy prospector had holed up in this cabin for years, convinced there was gold in the mountain, how he'd died alone during the blizzard of '42, talking to himself and scribbling plans that made no sense, how his ghost still wandered these hills, looking for something he'd never finished. Jester didn't believe in ghosts, but he believed in cold. The wind was picking up again, and snow had begun falling in thick, heavy flakes that stuck to everything. If he was going to survive another night, he needed to seal that gap in the wall before dark. He selected a plank from the pile of debris that had once been part of the cabin's interior walls. The wood was solid pine beneath the weathered surface, better than he'd hoped. Using the charcoal, he marked where to cut, measuring twice like he had seen the carpenter do when they'd built the new church in town. The saw moved through the wood with surprising ease, the teeth biting clean and true. But as he worked, Jester began to notice things that made his skin prickle. The measurements seemed to know themselves. When he held up the square to check his angles, the lines were always perfect, even though he couldn't remember being so careful. The nails drove straight and true with Pa's old hammer, sinking flush with the wood surface in exactly 3 strikes each time, and the new board fit into the gap as if it had been custom-made, sealing tight against the wind. By the time darkness fell, Jester had repaired not just the gap, but an entire section of the north wall. His hands were raw and aching, his stomach cramped with hunger, but the cabin felt warmer, solid, like it was remembering how to be a home again. He huddled in the corner where the repairs met the old stone fireplace, pulling his threadbare coat tight around his shoulders. Pa's abandonment felt less sharp now, cushioned by the satisfaction of work well done. He'd never fixed anything important before. Pa had always said he was too clumsy, too stupid, too much like his dead mother to be trusted with real tools. But these tools felt right in his hands, like they wanted to be used. As the wind settled into its nightly rhythm and snow continued to pile against the windows, Jester closed his eyes and tried to sleep. The cabin creaked around him, but it was a good sound now, a sound of timbers settling into their proper places. That's when he heard the voice for the first time. "Good work on that north wall, boy, but tomorrow you'll want to start on the foundation stones. Can't build nothing lasting on a foundation that's not true." Jester's eyes snapped open. The voice was quiet, barely louder than the wind, but unmistakably there. An old man's voice, rough with age and kindness. "Who's there?" Jester whispered. Silence. Just the storm and the settling wood and his own rapid heartbeat. But on the wall beside the fireplace, etched faint and silvery in the stone as if drawn by moonlight, Jester could swear he saw the outline of something that looked like building plans. lines and measurements and notations in a handwriting that seemed to shimmer and fade when he looked directly at it. He closed his eyes again, telling himself it was just hunger playing tricks on his mind. The voice came once more, soft as snowfall. "Sleep now, boy. Tomorrow we'll build something worthwhile." Jester woke to pale dawn light filtering through the gaps he hadn't yet repaired, and for a blessed moment he forgot where he was. The cabin was warmer than it had been in days, and his body ached the way it did after a good day's work rather than from cold and fear. Then memory crashed back, Pa driving away without looking back, the blizzard, the long walk up the mountain with nowhere else to go. He sat up, rubbing circulation back into his numb fingers, and looked toward the fireplace wall. No mysterious markings, just weathered stone and the ghost shadows of soot from fires long dead. The voice must have been a dream, born from exhaustion and hunger, and the strange relief of having something to do with his hands. But the tools were real. They lay where he'd left them, the leather pouch soft and dark against the cabin's rough planks. And the wall he'd repaired looked even better in daylight, solid and true, fitted together with a precision that surprised him. Had he really done that? It looked like the work of someone who'd been carpentry for years, not a boy who'd never been trusted with anything sharper than a butter knife. Jester's stomach clenched with hunger. He'd eaten the last of the stale biscuits Pa had thrown him yesterday morning, before everything went wrong, before the drinking got bad enough that neighbors started looking sideways at their ramshackle house on the outskirts of Bitter Creek, before Pa decided that 8-year-old boys were more trouble than they were worth, and drove Jester up into the mountains like he was dumping unwanted furniture. "You're just like her," Pa had said, spitting the words like they tasted bad. "Worthless and weak and too stupid to know when you're not wanted." Jester pushed the memory away and focused on immediate problems. Food, water, warmth, the basics of staying alive, until he could figure out what came next. Outside, the storm had gentled to light snow, though the drifts reached halfway up the cabin's walls. He broke ice from the bucket by the door and sucked on the pieces to wet his throat, then ventured outside to gather firewood from the pile of broken timbers scattered around the cabin's foundation. That's when he saw them, the foundation stones the voice had mentioned. The cabin sat on a base of fitted granite blocks, but time and weather had shifted them out of alignment. Some had cracked, others had sunk into the soft mountain soil, creating gaps that let cold air flow freely underneath the floorboards. It was obvious now why the cabin had felt so frigid. The foundation was failing, just as the voice had said. Can't build nothing lasting on a foundation that's not true. Jester knelt beside the largest displaced stone, running his small hands over its surface. It was massive, easily 3 times his weight, but loose in its setting. With the right leverage, the right technique, maybe he could shift it back into place. He'd watched the stonemasons working on the bank in Bitter Creek, seen how they used wedges and levers to move blocks that seemed impossible to budge. The morning passed quickly as he worked, using a broken timber as a lever and smaller stones as fulcrums. Jester began the slow process of repositioning the foundation. It was back-breaking work for someone his size, but every small success filled him with a satisfaction he'd never felt before. This wasn't like school, where he stumbled over letters that wouldn't stay still on the page. This wasn't like home, where every attempt to help earned him a cuff across the head and a reminder that he was more hindrance than help. This was building, creating, making something broken into something whole. By midday, he'd reset 3 of the smaller stones. His hands were scraped raw, and his shoulders screamed with exhaustion. But the corner of the cabin already felt more solid underfoot, more like a real foundation. As he paused to rest, sucking snow to ease his thirst, Jester found himself thinking about the stories the older boys told about Thomas Whitmore. They said he'd been crazy, talking to himself as he worked on mysterious projects no one understood, but maybe that wasn't madness. Maybe it was just the sound of a man who'd found something worth doing, something that made him forget about being alone. Jester understood that feeling now. For the first time since Ma died 3 years ago, He wasn't thinking about all the ways he'd failed to measure up. He wasn't hearing Pa's voice telling him he was worthless, clumsy, a burden nobody wanted. He was just thinking about the work, which stone to move next, how to shore up the gaps, what repairs would make the biggest difference. The voice came again as afternoon shadows began to lengthen, so quiet he might have imagined it. "Foundation's looking better, boy. You've got good hands for the work." This time, Jester didn't jump. He just nodded and kept working, as if having conversations with empty air was the most natural thing in the world. As the sun reached its peak and began its slow descent toward the western ridges, Jester found himself talking back. "This cornerstone's giving me trouble," he said, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the December cold. "Feels like it wants to sink deeper no matter how I brace it." "Ground soft there," came the voice, clearer now than it had ever been. "Dig down about a foot. You'll find clay. Need to lay gravel first, then sand. Can't set stone on clay. It'll shift with every freeze and thaw." Jester paused, his hand still gripping the makeshift lever. He was talking to empty air, and empty air was talking back with advice that made perfect sense. Any sane person would be terrified. Any normal boy would run screaming down the mountain, preferring to freeze in the open rather than stay in a cabin haunted by the dead. But Jester had never been accused of being normal, and sanity seemed like a luxury he couldn't afford. If a ghost wanted to teach him how to build, he'd listen. It wasn't like he had anywhere else to go. He spent the rest of the afternoon following the voice's instructions, digging through frozen soil until he hit the clay layer, exactly where the voice said it would be. He gathered gravel from the creek bed below the cabin, breaking through ice to reach the stones underneath. The work was methodical, purposeful, and with each step the voice grew more distinct, more present. By evening, Jester had reset the cornerstone properly, and the difference was remarkable. The entire section of foundation felt solid now, immovable. But as he gathered his tools in the failing light, something else caught his attention. Footprints, fresh horse tracks in the snow leading up the mountain path, multiple horses moving at a steady pace. Someone was coming. Jester's heart hammered against his ribs. Pa had made it clear he didn't want him back, but maybe someone from town had noticed he was missing. Maybe Mrs. Henderson from the general store, who'd always been kind to him. Maybe even the sheriff, though Sheriff Morrison had never shown much interest in what happened to unwanted children. The voice spoke again, urgent now. "Best put those tools away, boy. Hide them proper. Some secrets aren't ready for the world." Without questioning why, Jester quickly gathered the tools and returned them to their hiding place behind the loose board. His fingers moved with surprising certainty, sealing the gap so perfectly that no one would guess it had ever been disturbed. Just in time. 3 riders emerged from the tree line as full darkness settled over the mountain. Lantern light bobbed between the pines, casting wild shadows that danced across the snow. Jester pressed himself against the cabin's front window, watching through a crack in the shutters as the men approached. He recognized the lead rider immediately, Mr. Caldwell, who owned the mining rights to most of this mountain. Behind him rode 2 men Jester didn't know, one wearing the kind of fine coat that marked him as someone from outside Bitter Creek, the other armed with a rifle and scanning the forest like he expected trouble. They reined in their horses 50 yards from the cabin, close enough that their voices carried clearly in the cold air. "You sure the boy came up here?" The stranger's accent was different, Eastern, educated. "Tracks lead straight up the mountain," Caldwell replied. "Kid's probably dead by now. 3 days in this weather, no supplies, but you wanted to see the place, so here we are. And you're certain this is the Whitmore cabin?" "Positive. Been empty for 50 years, ever since the old prospector died. Local folks won't go near it, claim it's cursed." Caldwell spat into the snow. "Superstitious nonsense, but it keeps trespassers away." The Eastern man dismounted, pulling a leather satchel from his saddlebags. "The geological surveys from back east are quite specific, Mr. Caldwell. Thomas Whitmore wasn't just any prospector, he was a trained engineer, and his final reports mentioned discoveries that could revolutionize mining operations throughout the territory. If his notes are still in there..." Then we split whatever we find, as agreed. Caldwell swung down from his horse. But I'm warning you, place gives me the crawls. We search fast and get out. Jester's blood turned to ice water. They weren't looking for him at all. They wanted something from the cabin, something connected to Thomas Whitmore, and if they found him here, there was no telling what they'd do to keep their secret. The voice whispered so softly only he could hear. Choice time, boy. You can run out the back, try to make it down the mountain in the dark, or you can stay and fight for what's yours. What's mine? Jester thought desperately. He was just a lost child hiding in a dead man's cabin. But then he looked around at the walls he'd repaired, the foundation he'd stabilized, the tools that had fit his hands like they'd been waiting for him. This place had sheltered him when he had nowhere else to go. It had given him work when he needed purpose. It had given him a voice when he was completely alone. Maybe that made it his, at least a little bit. The men were approaching the door now, their lanterns casting long rectangles of light across the threshold. In seconds, they'd be inside. Jester had to choose. Jester crouched frozen beside the window, his body caught between the urge to run and the desperate need to stay. The men's boots crunched closer through the snow, 20 yards now, maybe less. His legs trembled with the desire to bolt through the back door, to take his chances in the dark forest rather than face whatever Caldwell and his companions might do to a witness. But something held him rooted in place, and it wasn't just fear. Fight for what's yours, the voice had said. The words echoed in his mind like a challenge he wasn't sure he could meet. What did he know about fighting? Pa had always said he was too small, too weak, too much like Ma to stand up to anything that mattered. 8-year-old boys didn't fight grown men with rifles and claims to mining rights. 8-year-old boys hid until the danger passed, if they were smart. The lantern light grew brighter, painting yellow squares across the cabin's interior walls. Jester pressed himself deeper into the shadows beside the fireplace, his heart hammering so loud he was certain the men would hear it the moment they stepped inside. Through the window, he could see Caldwell's face, hard and angular in the lamplight, eyes scanning the cabin's exterior with the calculating gaze of someone appraising property. Property. That's all this was to them. A place to ransack for whatever Thomas Whitmore had left behind, some secret that could make them rich. They didn't see the careful repairs to the north wall, or notice how the foundation stones had been reset. They couldn't hear the way the cabin's timbers had stopped groaning in the wind, or feel how the space had transformed from a cold ruin into something that felt almost like home. They didn't know that someone lived here now. The rational part of Jester's mind screamed at him to run. These were powerful men who wouldn't hesitate to hurt a child if he stood between them and their prize. Caldwell owned half the mountain, and the eastern stranger carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to taking what he wanted. The armed man was scanning the tree line like he'd done this kind of work before. But another part of him, a part that had only awakened in these past few days, rebelled against the idea of abandoning the first place that had ever felt like his. This cabin had sheltered him when his own father wouldn't. It had given him tools when he'd been left with nothing. It had taught him, through the voice that whispered in the walls, that his hands were good for something besides being targets for Pa's anger. You're worthless, Pa's voice echoed in his memory. Just like her. Too weak to be worth keeping. Jester's jaw clenched. Maybe Pa was right about him being weak. Maybe he was too small to fight these men, too young to stake a claim to anything. But for 3 days, he'd been building something here, making something broken into something whole, and the voice, Thomas Whitmore's voice, had called his work good. That had to count for something. The cabin door rattled as Caldwell tested the latch. Locked, he muttered. Hand me that crowbar. Jester's breath caught. In seconds they'd be inside, searching every corner for whatever secrets Whitmore had hidden. They'd find the tools, discover the repairs, realize someone had been living here. And then what? Jester wondered desperately. Would they drag him back to town? Leave him to freeze? Or would they decide he knew too much about their midnight treasure hunt? The voice whispered again, so faint he might have imagined it. Sometimes courage isn't about being brave, boy. Sometimes it's about being too stubborn to quit. Jester closed his eyes, thinking of the foundation stones he'd reset that afternoon. Each one had seemed impossible to move at first, too heavy, too deeply embedded, too stubborn to budge. But with the right leverage, the right technique, even the biggest obstacles could shift. Maybe men weren't so different from stones. The door splintered open with a sharp crack of wood. Lamplight flooded the cabin's interior, and Caldwell stepped inside, followed by his companions. Their boots echoed on the floorboards Jester had reinforced, but they moved with the careless urgency of men focused on their goal. "Start with the fireplace," the Eastern stranger said. Prospectors always hid their important papers near the hearth, kept them dry. Jester pressed himself deeper into the shadows, his mind racing. He could still slip out the back while they searched the front room, still run into the forest and hope to find shelter somewhere else, still choose survival over a foolish attachment to walls and stones that had never truly belonged to him. But as the men began tearing through Whitmore's old cabin, pulling down boards and scattering debris, Jester felt something harden in his chest, a stubbornness he'd inherited from Ma, perhaps, or maybe just the simple refusal of someone who'd finally found something worth protecting. He wasn't running, not this time. Jester stepped out of the shadows. The movement was small, deliberate, just a shift from the darkness beside the fireplace into the amber circle cast by Caldwell's lantern. But in the confined space of the cabin, it might as well have been a thunderclap. All three men froze. The Eastern stranger's hand dropped to his coat pocket. The armed man swung his rifle toward the sound. Caldwell's weathered face went through a series of expressions: surprise, confusion, then something approaching anger. "What in the hell?" Caldwell started. "Evening," Jester said, his voice steadier than he'd expected. The word came out clear and calm, though his heart was beating so fast he could feel it in his throat. "You're in my cabin." My cabin. The words surprised him as much as they did the intruders, but saying them aloud felt right, like something that had been true for longer than he'd realized. Caldwell lowered his lantern, squinting through the light. "Mac Kinley's boy. Jesus Christ, kid, we thought you were dead." He turned to his companions. "This is the one I told you about, the drunk son. Father dumped him up here 3 days ago." "I see that," the Eastern stranger said slowly, studying Jester like he was examining an unexpected geological sample. "And he's been living here? In this weather?" "Apparently." Caldwell's initial surprise was hardening into irritation. "Look, boy, I don't know how you've managed to stay alive up here, but you need to clear out. We have business to conduct." Jester didn't move. Couldn't move, really. His legs had locked in place the moment he'd committed to this path. But the strange calm that had settled over him when he spoke was still there, growing stronger with each heartbeat. "What kind of business?" he asked. The armed man shifted restlessly, his rifle still half raised. "Maybe we should just—" "No." The Eastern stranger held up a hand. His pale eyes never left Jester's face. "I'm curious. You've been here 3 days, boy. Alone. In December. How?" Jester's mind raced. How much should he say? How much could they believe? "Fixed what was broken," he said finally. "Made it warmer." Caldwell barked a laugh. You're 8 years old." 9. The lie came automatically, the same one he'd been telling since Ma died, trying to seem older, more capable, less of a burden. "And I can show you." He gestured toward the north wall where he'd reset the first loose board. In the lantern light, his repair work was clearly visible, the wood fitted together with precise joints, gaps sealed, the whole section looking solid and new. The Eastern stranger moved closer, running his fingers along the boards. "Interesting. This is quality work. Very quality work." He glanced back at Jester. "Who taught you carpentry?" "Nobody." Another truth that felt strange in his mouth. Just learned. Just learned. The man's voice carried a note Jester couldn't identify. "And I suppose you just learned masonry too?" Because I noticed the foundation stones have been reset. Professional work, from what I can see. Caldwell was staring at the repaired wall with growing confusion. That wasn't like this before. I was up here 2 months ago checking the property boundaries. This place was falling apart. It was falling apart 4 days ago, Jester said. I fixed it. The admission hung in the air between them. Jester could see the men exchanging glances, could feel their skepticism warring with the evidence of their own eyes. A 9-year-old boy couldn't do this kind of work, but the repairs were real, undeniable. Tell them, whispered a voice in his mind, not Whitmore's voice this time, but his own. Tell them about the tools, the voice, the way the cabin talks to you. But that was madness. These men were here for secrets, but not those kinds of secrets. They wanted gold or land claims or engineering notes, tangible things they could sell, not ghost stories about a boy who heard whispers in the walls. You've been busy, the Eastern stranger said carefully. But I'm afraid we still need you to leave. We have legitimate business here, and it requires privacy. What kind of business? Jester repeated. Caldwell's patience snapped. None of your damn business, boy. This is my land and I'll do what I please on it. Now get out before we throw you out. The threat should have terrified him. Should have sent him scrambling for the door like the scared, unwanted child he'd always been. But something had changed in these past few minutes. Standing his ground, claiming the cabin as his own, seeing the confusion in these powerful men's faces when confronted with work they couldn't explain, it had awakened something in him he'd never known existed. He wasn't running, not from the cabin, not from these men, not from the truth of what he'd built here. No, Jester said quietly. This is my home now. The armed man raised his rifle. Kid's going to be a problem. But the Eastern stranger held up his hand again, his pale eyes bright with sudden interest. Wait, I think this boy might be exactly what we need. The words hung in the cold air like frost crystals, visible and sharp. Jester felt the weight of 3 pairs of eyes studying him, Caldwell's irritated, the gunman's calculating, and the Eastern stranger's unnervingly bright with possibility. What do you mean? Caldwell demanded, lowering his lantern until shadows danced wildly across the cabin walls. The stranger stepped closer to Jester, close enough that the boy could smell expensive tobacco and leather on his coat. Think about it, Caldwell. We came here looking for Thomas Whitmore's engineering notes, his survey reports, his mining innovations. But what if the real treasure isn't something he wrote down? You're talking in riddles, Hartwell. Am I? Hartwell gestured toward the repaired wall. Look at this work. Look at the precision of these joints, the way the foundation stones have been reset. This isn't amateur carpentry. This is the work of someone who understands engineering principles that most grown men never master. Jester's stomach tightened. The way Hartwell was looking at him reminded him of how the livestock buyers examined horses at market, searching for value, for usefulness, for profit. The boy learned from someone, Hartwell continued, someone who knew Whitmore's techniques, someone who understood his methods, his pale eyes fixed on Jester. Who taught you to build like this, son? The truth sat on Jester's tongue like a coal from the fire, too hot to swallow, too dangerous to spit out. The dead man who lives in the walls taught me, the ghost who whispers instructions while I work. Even thinking it sounded like madness. Books, Jester said instead. Found books. What books? Where? Jester's mind raced. He gestured vaguely toward the fireplace. Hidden. Old books about building. Caldwell and the gunman immediately moved toward the hearth, but Hartwell remained focused on Jester. Show me, he said softly. Show you what? Show me how you reset those foundation stones. A boy your size couldn't move rocks that heavy without proper leverage techniques. I want to see exactly how you did it. The request sounded reasonable, but something in Hartwell's voice made Jester's skin crawl. This wasn't curiosity, this was interrogation. The man was testing him, looking for proof of something. It's dark, Jester said. Can't see proper in the dark. Then we'll wait until morning. Hartwell smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. "We'll all wait together. Make sure you don't wander off during the night." The threat was delicate, but unmistakable. Jester glanced toward the door, measuring distances, calculating his chances of reaching the forest before the gunman could react. But Hartwell seemed to read his thoughts. "Jenkins," he called to the armed man, "keep an eye on our young friend while we search. Make sure he stays comfortable." Jenkins nodded, positioning himself between Jester and the exit. The rifle remained casually ready. "Now then," Hartwell said, turning back to the cabin. "Let's see what other secrets this place holds." Jester watched in growing alarm as the three men began systematically dismantling the cabin's interior. They pulled up floorboards, tore down wall panels, searched every corner and crevice. Each piece of Whitmore's original structure that came loose felt like a piece of Jester's own skin being peeled away. But worse was what they weren't finding. "Nothing," Caldwell muttered, tossing aside another handful of debris. "No papers, no maps, no mining reports, just old wood and mouse droppings." "Keep looking," Hartwell insisted. Whitmore was too careful to leave his discoveries unrecorded. "They have to be here somewhere." Jester bit his tongue to keep from speaking. He could have told them they were searching in the wrong places. The cabin's real secrets weren't hidden in walls or under floorboards. They were in the voice that whispered instructions, in the tools that fit his hands, like they'd been waiting decades for him to find them, in the strange certainty that guided his repairs. But those weren't the kind of secrets these men could steal and sell. As the destruction continued, Jester felt something building in his chest, not fear but anger. These men were tearing apart everything he'd worked to repair, treating the cabin like it was just another piece of property to be exploited. They didn't understand that this place was alive somehow, that it had chosen to shelter him when he'd had nowhere else to go. "Wait," Jenkins said suddenly. He was studying the wall where Jester had made his first repairs, his head tilted like he was listening to something. "You hear that?" The other men stopped their searching. In the sudden quiet, a sound became audible, a low creaking, like timber settling in the cold. But there was something rhythmic about it, almost like breathing. "Just the wood adjusting to temperature changes," Caldwell said, but his voice carried less conviction than his words. "No," Jenkins said slowly. "That's not settling. That's something else." Hartwell moved to the wall, pressing his ear against the boards. His expression shifted from skepticism to sharp attention. "There's definitely something unusual about the acoustics in here." Jester's blood turned cold. They were starting to hear it, the voice he'd been listening to for 3 days, the presence that lived in the cabin's bones. And if they heard the voice, they'd want to know what it was saying. They'd want to know why a dead prospector's spirit was teaching carpentry to an abandoned child. They'd want to understand the real secret of the Whitmore cabin, the secret that wasn't meant for men like them. The creaking grew louder, more deliberate, like footsteps moving through the cabin's frame. Jester watched the three men's faces transform from skepticism to unease as the sound seemed to migrate from wall to wall, defying any logical explanation. "Don't let them hear you," Jester pleaded silently to whatever presence dwelt in the timber. "Please don't let them know." But the voice that had guided him through 3 days of impossible repairs seemed to have its own agenda. The creaking intensified, and now Jester could make out what the others couldn't yet, the familiar whisper threading through the wood grain, growing stronger with each passing moment. "Fascinating," Hartwell breathed, pulling out a small notebook and beginning to sketch the cabin's interior. This could be some kind of acoustic phenomenon. Sound channeling through the wood structure, perhaps amplified by temperature differentials. Caldwell looked less convinced. "Sounds like somebody walking around up there to me." "There is no up there," Jenkins pointed out, rifle still trained casually in Jester's direction. "This is a single-story cabin. No loft, no second floor." The boy's mind raced as he watched the men grow increasingly agitated. He recognized the expression creeping across their faces, the same look Pa got when things stopped making sense, when the world refused to behave according to his expectations. That look always preceded violence. Jester needed to redirect their attention, needed to give them something else to focus on before they decided the cabin's strangeness was his fault. His eyes fell on the loose floorboard near the fireplace, the one where he'd hidden Pa's tools on his first night. "The books," he said suddenly, loud enough to cut through the mysterious creaking. "The books I found, they're under there." Hartwell spun toward him. "Where?" Jester pointed to the floorboard, his heart hammering. There were no books, of course, just the tools that had somehow called to him in the darkness, guiding his hands to repairs no 9-year-old should have been capable of making. But maybe the tools themselves would satisfy these men's hunger for tangible answers. Caldwell was already prying up the board with his crowbar. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, reaching into the space beneath. "There is something here." He pulled out Pa's hammer first, then the saw, then the collection of smaller tools that had felt like extensions of Jester's own fingers. In the lamplight, they looked unremarkable, just worn implements stained with decades of honest labor. "Tools," Jenkins said flatly. "Not books. Tools." "Old tools," Hartwell added, taking the hammer from Caldwell and examining it closely. "Very old. Look at the maker's mark here. This is a Whitmore and Sons piece. Thomas Whitmore's father ran a smithy in Pennsylvania before the family moved west." Jester's breath caught. He'd assumed the tools belonged to Pa, abandoned along with everything else when the man rode away into the storm. But if they were Whitmore's... "The boy's been using Whitmore's own tools," Hartwell continued, his excitement building. "That explains the quality of the work. These implements were made by craftsmen who understood precision engineering." Relief flooded through Jester as the men's attention shifted from the cabin's supernatural acoustics to the more mundane mystery of the tools. Let them believe that superior implements explained his impossible repairs. Let them think Thomas Whitmore's legacy lived in steel and wood rather than in whispered instructions that defied death itself. But his relief was short-lived. Hartwell was studying him again with that calculating intensity, notebook still in hand. "You said you've been here 3 days," the man said slowly, "but these tools have been hidden for much longer. The wood around them shows years of settling. So, how did you know exactly where to find them?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Jester could feel the walls closing in, not the cabin's walls, which had sheltered and protected him, but the trap these men were weaving with their logic and suspicion. "Lucky guess," he said weakly. Hartwell stepped closer. "There's something else happening here, something you're not telling us." He glanced at his companions. The boy knows more than he's letting on. About Whitmore, about this place, about whatever the old prospector discovered up here. The creaking in the walls grew more agitated, as if responding to Hartwell's accusations. Jester could feel the presence stirring, could sense Thomas Whitmore's spirit growing restless as these strangers violated his sanctuary. "We should take him with us," Hartwell declared. "Back to town. Let the proper authorities question him about what he's found here." "Take me where?" Jester's voice cracked on the words. "Somewhere you can be properly cared for," Hartwell said smoothly. "Somewhere you can tell us everything you know about Thomas Whitmore's work." Jenkins shouldered his rifle, understanding the unspoken instruction. Caldwell moved to block the door. The trap was closing, and Jester realized with growing desperation that his stubborn decision to stand his ground might have cost him everything. The cabin's creaking reached a crescendo, and somewhere in the sound, Jester heard the whisper that had guided him through 3 impossible days. "Time to choose, boy. Fight or flee." The whisper cut through Jester's fear like one of Whitmore's sharp tools through green timber. He looked at the 3 men, Jenkins with his rifle ready, Caldwell blocking the exit, Hartwell approaching with that predatory gleam in his pale eyes, and felt something crystallize inside his chest. He'd spent 9 years running from Pa's fists, running from the judgment in neighbors' eyes, running from the truth of what his life had become. Even here in the cabin, he'd been running in his own way, hiding the voice, denying the impossible things he'd witnessed, pretending his survival was just luck and stubbornness. But Thomas Whitmore hadn't run. The old prospector had died in this place rather than abandon what he'd built. what he'd discovered, and his spirit had been waiting 50 years for someone to carry his work forward. "I'm not going anywhere," Jester said, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. Hartwell smiled that cold smile. "I'm afraid that's not your decision to make, son. Isn't it?" Jester stepped backward until his shoulders touched the north wall, the first wall he'd repaired where Whitmore's presence felt strongest. "This is my home, these are my tools, and you're trespassing." Jenkins raised his rifle properly now. "Kid's got spine, I'll give him that. But spine don't stop bullets." The moment the threat left Jenkins' lips, the cabin erupted. Every board, beam and timber began creaking at once, not the gentle settling Jester had grown accustomed to, but a violent groaning like the building was tearing itself apart. The sound was deafening, overwhelming, and underneath it all, clear as Sunday bells, came Thomas Whitmore's voice. "Get out of my house." The words thundered through the frame with such force that dust rained from the ceiling. Caldwell stumbled backward, his face white with terror. Jenkins spun in circles, trying to aim his rifle at an enemy he couldn't see. Only Hartwell held his ground, though his notebook shook in his trembling hands. "Impossible," the Eastern man breathed. "There has to be a rational explanation." His words were cut off as every loose tool in the cabin suddenly took flight. Hammers, saws, and measuring implements launched themselves from the scattered pile near the fireplace, not randomly but with deliberate intent. Jenkins dove for cover as a chisel embedded itself in the doorframe inches from his head. Caldwell yelped as a plane grazed his shoulder, tearing his coat. But none of the flying tools came near Jester. They parted around him like he stood in the eye of a hurricane, and he understood with crystal clarity that Whitmore wasn't just defending the cabin, he was defending the boy who'd become part of it. "Enough!" Hartwell shouted over the chaos. "We know you're doing this somehow, boy, some kind of trick with wires, or—" His accusation died as the floorboards beneath his feet began shifting, individual planks rising and falling like piano keys. The man stumbled, arms windmilling as the cabin itself tried to buck him off like an angry horse. Jester pressed himself against the wall and felt the wood warm under his palms. The whisper came again, urgent now. "Show them what you've learned. Show them what we've built together." Understanding flooded through him. This wasn't just about defending the cabin anymore. It was about proving that some things couldn't be taken, couldn't be bought, couldn't be owned by men who saw only profit in everything they touched. Whitmore's real discovery hadn't been gold or engineering techniques. It had been something far more valuable, the knowledge that a place could choose its people just as much as people chose their places. Jester placed both hands flat against the wall and spoke directly to the presence he could feel pulsing through every fiber of the structure. "Show them," he whispered. "Show them what you really found up here." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Every repair Jester had made over the past 3 days began reversing itself, but not randomly. The work undid itself in precise sequence, each board and stone moving back to its original position with mechanical precision, demonstrating the exact process by which a 9-year-old boy had accomplished impossible feats of engineering. Then, just as suddenly, the repairs rebuilt themselves. Boards fitted together with mathematical precision, stones levitated into perfect alignment, gaps sealed themselves as if invisible hands were working with supernatural skill. The three intruders watched in stunned silence as the cabin demonstrated its own restoration, showing them work that no living person, certainly no child, could possibly have performed alone. When the display finished, the silence was absolute, except for the men's ragged breathing. Hartwell's notebook slipped from his nerveless fingers. What are you?" Jester straightened, no longer afraid. The greatest challenge of his young life hadn't been surviving the blizzard or learning impossible skills. It had been this moment, when he had to choose between hiding what he'd become and embracing it completely. "I'm the new caretaker," he said simply, "and you need to leave, now." The three men didn't move. Jenkins' rifle hung forgotten in his slack grip, and Caldwell's mouth worked soundlessly as he stared at the walls that had just rebuilt themselves. But it was Hartwell who broke the spell, his Eastern education warring with what his eyes had witnessed. "Elaborate trickery," he said, though his voice shook. "Mirrors, perhaps, hidden mechanisms." He bent to retrieve his fallen notebook, and when he straightened, his pale eyes had regained their calculating gleam, but impressive enough to make our fortune. The words hit Jester like a physical blow. "What? Think about it, boy." Hartwell's smile returned, wider and hungrier than before. "A cabin that repairs itself, tools that move without human hands, the spirits of the dead performing manual labor." He gestured expansively at the restored walls. "Do you have any idea what people would pay to witness such wonders?" "This isn't some carnival show," Jester protested, but even as he spoke, he could see the wheels turning in Hartwell's mind. "Isn't it?" The man pulled out a pencil and began sketching rapidly. "The miracle cabin of Montana Territory. Come see the boy who speaks to ghosts. Watch the dead work alongside the living. Admission 50 cents. Private demonstrations available for serious investors." Jenkins was nodding now, his fear transforming into greedy excitement. Could set up a whole operation, bring folks in by railroad from back east, build hotels, restaurants. "No." Jester's voice cracked with desperation. "You can't. This place isn't meant for that." "Who's going to stop us?" Caldwell had found his courage again, emboldened by visions of profit. "You? You're just one boy in the middle of nowhere." Jester pressed his hands against the wall again, seeking Whitmore's guidance, but the whisper that came back filled him with dread. "I'm sorry, son. I can make them leave, but I can't make them stay away, and I can't stop them from telling others what they've seen." The full horror of his situation crashed over Jester like an avalanche. He'd revealed the cabin's secrets to protect himself, but in doing so, he'd doomed the one place that had ever truly sheltered him. These men would spread word of what they'd witnessed. Others would come, not just treasure hunters and scholars, but gawkers and profiteers who would strip away everything sacred about this place. "We'll need to establish clear ownership first," Hartwell was saying, his pencil flying across the notebook pages. "File claims with the territorial government, perhaps arrange for the boy to be declared a ward of the court." "Ward of the court?" Jester's blood turned to ice. "What does that mean?" Hartwell looked up from his sketching with mock sympathy. "It means we'll take proper care of you, son. Make sure you're fed and clothed and educated, and in return you'll demonstrate your remarkable abilities for our paying customers." The word rang in Jester's ears like a death knell. Customers. They meant to put him on display like a trained animal, to parade his connection to Whitmore's spirit before crowds of strangers who would see only spectacle where there should be reverence. "I won't do it," he said, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Jenkins hefted his rifle meaningfully. "Don't reckon you'll have much choice in the matter." Jester looked around the cabin that had become his sanctuary, seeing it now through their eyes. Not a home, but a commodity. Not a sacred place where the living and dead had found common purpose, but a curiosity to be exploited. Every board he'd lovingly restored, every stone he'd carefully fitted, all of it would be reduced to props in some grotesque theatrical performance. "Run," came Whitmore's urgent whisper. "Take the tools and run. Find another place. Start again." But Jester knew there was no other place. This cabin, this partnership with a dead prospector's restless spirit, it was unique, irreplaceable. If he fled now, he'd be abandoning not just his home, but Thomas Whitmore himself. The old man had waited 50 years for someone to complete his work. How could Jester condemn him to another 50 years of solitude? Yet staying meant surrendering to Hartwell's scheme. It meant becoming a prisoner of his own gifts, performing miracles on command for the entertainment of strangers, who would never understand what they were truly witnessing. "We'll start back to town at first light," Hartwell announced, snapping his notebook shut. "Wire the territorial capital, file the necessary papers. This time next month, we'll have the most profitable attraction west of the Mississippi." Jester slumped against the wall, feeling Whitmore's presence flicker like a candle in a strong wind. The spirit was weakening, exhausted by the display that had revealed their secret to the worst possible witnesses. Everything Jester had built, everything he'd discovered about himself and his purpose, it was all crumbling like poorly mortised joints. The cabin that had chosen him as its caretaker was about to become his cage, and there was nothing a 9-year-old boy could do to stop it. The weight of defeat pressed down on Jester like the mountain snow that had driven him to this place. He closed his eyes and let his forehead rest against the warm wood of the wall, feeling Whitmore's presence flutter weakly beneath his palms. The old prospector's spirit was fading, not gone, but retreating deep into the bones of the cabin, like sap withdrawing into winter trees. "I'm sorry," came the whisper, so faint Jester had to strain to hear it. "Should have known this would happen. Should have warned you." But as those ghostly words faded, something else stirred in Jester's memory. A fragment of conversation from his first night here, when Whitmore had spoken of his greatest discovery. Not the engineering techniques or the precision tools, but something else entirely. "The mountain chose me," the voice had said, "just like it chose you." Jester's eyes snapped open. The mountain. In all his focus on the cabin and its miraculous repairs, he'd forgotten about the larger truth Whitmore had tried to share. This wasn't just about a building or even a spirit. It was about the living rock beneath their feet, the ancient presence that had drawn a lonely prospector to dig his first shaft 50 years ago. And if the mountain had chosen Thomas Whitmore, if it had chosen Jester himself, then perhaps— "You're making a mistake," Jester said quietly, turning to face the 3 men who were dividing his future between them like shares in a mining claim. Hartwell barely glanced up from his notebook. "Oh, and what mistake would that be? You think this is about the cabin, about Mr. Whitmore's ghost." Jester stepped away from the wall, moving toward the center of the room. "You think you can own it, control it, put it on display for your customers? Can't we?" Jenkins asked with a sneer. Jester knelt and placed both hands flat against the floorboards, feeling the pulse that ran deeper than wood, deeper than foundation stones. Mr. Whitmore didn't build this cabin because he found gold up here. He built it because the mountain told him to. The 3 men exchanged glances, and Hartwell made an impatient gesture. "Mountain spirits now? Really, boy, you're reaching—" His words cut off as the floor beneath Jester's hands began to warm. Not the gentle warmth of living wood, but something older and more profound. The deep heat of stone that had been gathering sunlight and starlight since before men ever walked these peaks. The warmth spread outward in ripples, and where it touched, the floorboards became translucent, not transparent like glass, but clear as mountain water, revealing the foundation beneath, and beneath that, the bedrock itself. And in that ancient stone, patterns began to glow. Not carved patterns like the blueprints that had appeared on the cabin walls, but natural formations in the rock, veins of mineral that pulsed with their own inner light, creating a vast network that stretched far beyond the cabin's modest footprint. The glowing lines formed geometric shapes of impossible complexity, designs that made Whitmore's engineering sketches look like a child's first attempts at drawing. "Dear God," Caldwell whispered, falling to his knees beside the luminous floor. "What is it?" Jester could feel the answer rising from the stone itself, flowing through his hands like electricity. "The mountain's blueprint," he said with wonder, "not for a cabin or a mine, but for something else entirely." The patterns in the rock pulsed brighter, and suddenly Jester understood why Whitmore had spent 50 years digging. The old prospector hadn't been searching for gold. He'd been trying to uncover this, to expose the mountain's own hidden architecture. The cabin hadn't been built as shelter, but as a lens, a focal point where human consciousness could commune with something infinitely older and more intelligent than any ghost. "The mountain's alive," Jester breathed, not like an animal or a person, but aware, thinking. "And it's been waiting." "Waiting for what?" Hartwell demanded, but his voice had lost its confident edge. Jester looked up at the three men, seeing them clearly for the first time. They weren't evil exactly, just small, limited by their need to own and control and profit from everything they encountered. They could no more possess what lived beneath this mountain than they could capture the aurora or bottle the wind. For someone who would listen, he said, someone who wouldn't try to dig it up or put it in chains or charge admission to see it, someone who would just be with it. The light in the stone pulsed once more, and Jester felt a presence vast beyond imagining brush against his consciousness. Not Thomas Whitmore's familiar whisper, but something that spoke without words, communicated in pure understanding. And in that moment of contact, Jester finally comprehended the true scope of what had chosen him. This wasn't about rebuilding a prospector's cabin or communing with the dead. This was about becoming the bridge between human understanding and something that predated civilization itself, a living mountain that had been dreaming in stone for millennia, waiting for the right soul to serve as its interpreter. The revelation struck him like lightning. He wasn't just the cabin's caretaker. He was the mountain's voice. The luminous patterns in the stone began to fade, but their meaning burned clear in Jester's mind. He remained kneeling on the now ordinary floorboards, his small hands still pressed against the wood, feeling the mountain's vast consciousness settling back into patient dormancy. The three men stared at him with expressions ranging from terror to naked greed, but their scheming voices seemed to come from very far away. "Now you understand," came Whitmore's whisper, stronger than before. "This was never about my unfinished work. It was about preparing you for yours." Jester nodded slowly, pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. The cabin repairs, the ghostly guidance, even his father's abandonment. It had all been leading to this moment of recognition. The mountain had been orchestrating events far longer than any of them realized, arranging circumstances with the patience that only geological time could teach. "The boy's lost his mind," Jenkins muttered, but his rifle trembled in his grip. Talking to empty air, seeing lights in solid rock. "The lights were real," Hartwell interrupted sharply. His notebook lay forgotten as he paced the small room like a caged animal. "We all saw them. Which means they can be documented, studied, replicated." His pale eyes fixed on Jester with renewed intensity. "Whatever trick you just performed, you'll teach us. We'll need to reproduce the effect reliably for paying audiences." Jester stood, and as he rose, he felt something fundamental shift inside him. The frightened, desperate boy who had stumbled into this cabin 3 days ago was gone, replaced by someone who carried the weight of an ancient trust. He was still 9 years old, still small and alone in a hostile world, but he was no longer powerless. "There's no trick to teach," he said calmly. "The mountain doesn't perform on command." "Everything has a price," Caldwell insisted, his merchant's mind already calculating possibilities. "Every man can be bought, every secret can be sold. You're just a child. You don't understand the value of what you possess." But that was exactly wrong. For the first time in his life, Jester understood his own value completely, not as a performer or a curiosity, but as something far more rare, a bridge between worlds that had been waiting eons to reconnect. "Tell them what they need to hear," Whitmore's voice suggested gently. "Not the whole truth, but enough to send them away." Jester considered this, studying the three men who had invaded his sanctuary. They were creatures of the surface world, driven by needs that the mountain found as incomprehensible as they found its ancient patience. But perhaps that very limitation could be turned to his advantage. "You're right," he said finally. "There is something valuable here. But it's not what you think." Hartwell leaned forward eagerly. "Go on." "The patterns in the stone, they're a map." Jester chose his words carefully, weaving truth and misdirection together. "Mr. Whitmore spent 50 years trying to follow them, digging tunnels, following the veins. He never found what he was looking for because he was searching in the wrong place." "Wrong place?" Jenkins lowered his rifle slightly. "What do you mean?" Jester moved to the eastern wall, the one section of the cabin he hadn't yet fully repaired. As his fingers traced the rough boards, He felt Whitmore's amused approval rippling through the wood. The real treasure isn't under this mountain. It's in the next valley over, where the mineral veins converge. This cabin was just a survey station, a place to study the patterns before following them to their source. It was a masterful lie, built on a foundation of truth. There were indeed mineral formations in the neighboring valley, iron and copper deposits that any competent prospector would recognize. Nothing as exotic as what lived beneath this mountain, but valuable enough to distract men whose vision extended no further than their own profit margins. Hartwell's eyes gleamed. You can read these patterns, follow them to this convergence point? Mr. Whitmore taught me. Jester gestured toward the wall where the faintest suggestion of the ghostly blueprints still lingered. But the real survey work needs to be done from the ridge above. This cabin is just the starting point. The lie hung in the air like morning mist, and Jester watched 3 sets of greedy eyes turn toward the eastern windows, toward the promise of conventional wealth in conventional places. He could almost see their thoughts shifting, abandoning dreams of supernatural exhibitions in favor of more familiar schemes involving claims and excavations and railroad investments. Clever boy, Whitmore whispered with paternal pride. Send them chasing shadows while the real treasure stays hidden. But Jester knew this was only a temporary reprieve. Sooner or later, these men or others like them would return, drawn by rumors of the miracle cabin and the boy who spoke with the dead. The mountain's secret was too profound to remain hidden forever, and his own role as its interpreter too important to abandon. As he watched Hartwell scribbling notes about survey expeditions and mining claims, Jester felt a deep calm settle over him. The mountain had chosen its voice wisely. He would need to be clever, patient, and strong, but for the first time since his father's abandonment, he wasn't facing the future alone. The mountain dreamed beneath his feet, and in that vast consciousness, Jester had found not just a home, but a purpose that would sustain him for whatever trials lay ahead. The 3 men departed before dawn, their excitement palpable as they discussed survey routes and claim filings in hushed, urgent tones. Jester watched from the cabin's single window as their lantern light bobbed down the mountain path, growing smaller until it vanished entirely into the grey pre-dawn mist. Only when their voices faded completely did he allow himself to exhale the breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "They'll be back." Whitmore's voice carried a note of gentle warning. "Maybe not those 3, but others like them. Word spreads fast in mining country, especially word about miraculous discoveries." Jester nodded, pressing his palm against the window's cold glass. He'd bought himself time, nothing more. The lie about treasure in the neighboring valley would occupy Hartwell and his associates for weeks, possibly months, but eventually they would exhaust that lead and return with harder questions and less patience. "How long do we have?" he asked aloud. "Hard to say. If they find enough ordinary mineral deposits to keep them busy, could be spring before they realize they've been chasing fool's gold. But if they come up empty..." The unspoken conclusion hung heavy in the morning air. Jester had revealed too much, shown them wonders that would haunt their dreams and fuel their ambitions. Men like Caldwell and Jenkins might be satisfied with conventional riches, but Hartwell was different, a true believer in the supernatural who would never stop searching for the source of what he'd witnessed. Jester turned from the window and surveyed his domain with new eyes. The cabin that had seemed like a miraculous refuge now felt like a fortress under siege. Every perfectly fitted joint, every impossibly precise angle, every board that had somehow repaired itself in the night, all of it was evidence of something that the outside world would never be content to leave alone. "You could run," Whitmore suggested quietly. "Take what you've learned and find another mountain, another place where the old earth dreams close to the surface. You don't owe this place anything." But that wasn't true, and they both knew it. Jester had felt the mountain's consciousness touch his own, had experienced that moment of pure communion with something ancient beyond measure. The bond forged in that instant wasn't something he could simply walk away from, any more than he could abandon his own shadow. "No," he said firmly. "Running won't solve anything. And besides—" He placed both hands against the wall, feeling the steady pulse of life within the wood, the stone, the very air itself. "This is where I belong. The mountain chose me, just like it chose you 50 years ago. I won't abandon that trust. When we need to prepare," Whitmore's voice carried new resolve. "If men are coming who want to cage and exploit what lives here, we need to be ready for them." Jester moved to the cabin's center, kneeling where he had first made contact with the mountain's consciousness. As his hands touched the floorboards, he felt that vast presence stir again, not the brilliant awakening of the previous night, but a gentler acknowledgement, like a sleeping giant briefly opening one eye. "Can you protect yourself?" he asked the mountain directly. "When they come with their surveys and their excavations and their plans to dig you up piece by piece?" The answer came not in words, but in images that flooded his mind. Roots that could crack foundation stones, springs that could redirect their course overnight, rock slides that could close passes and trails as easily as a man might shut a door. The mountain was anything but defenseless. It simply preferred the patience of geological time to the hasty violence of human conflict. But patience had its limits, and Jester sensed a growing restlessness in the ancient consciousness beneath his hands. For millennia, it had slept undisturbed, dreaming its slow stone dreams while forests rose and fell above its peaks. Now, suddenly, it was under assault by creatures whose entire existence flickered by in what seemed like moments of mountain time. "The earth is waking up," Whitmore observed, his ghostly presence flickering with unease. "All across these ranges, in places where the old consciousness runs deep, there's stirring, like the mountain is preparing for something." Jester felt it too, a subtle shift in the spiritual geography around them, as if other peaks were taking notice of what had happened here. His communion with this particular mountain had been noticed by others of its kind, and they were beginning to pay attention to the small drama unfolding in their midst. The realization struck him with the force of revelation. He wasn't just protecting one sacred site from exploitation. He was guarding the gateway to something much larger, a network of ancient consciousnesses that had been dormant for so long that modern humans had forgotten they ever existed. The weight of that responsibility should have crushed him. 3 days ago, he had been nothing more than an abandoned child fighting for survival. Now he stood at the center of a conflict between two entirely different ways of being, the quick, grasping hunger of human ambition and the vast, patient wisdom of living stone. But instead of feeling overwhelmed, Jester felt a strange sense of completion settling into his bones. This was why the mountain had chosen him. Not just to serve as its voice, but to stand as its guardian in the trials that were coming. He was no longer just surviving, he was finally truly home. The morning stillness shattered like glass when the first dynamite blast echoed across the valley. Jester bolted upright from his bedroll, the cabin walls trembling around him as the explosion's reverberations rolled through the mountain's bones. Through the eastern window, he could see smoke rising from the neighboring peaks. Not the lazy curl of a campfire, but the angry black plume of industrial excavation. "They found something," Whitmore's voice carried grim certainty. "Or think they have." But as Jester pressed his hands against the floor, feeling for the mountain's response, he encountered something that made his blood run cold. The vast consciousness beneath wasn't stirring with the gentle curiosity he'd grown accustomed to. It was waking with the slow, terrible fury of a giant roused from peaceful dreams by the stinging of ants. A second blast shook the cabin, closer this time, and Jester felt the mountain's pain like a physical blow. The network of sleeping peaks that had begun to take notice was now fully alert, their ancient communion crackling with something that felt dangerously like rage. "They're not just mining," Whitmore whispered, his ghostly presence flickering with distress. "They're following the mineral veins, trying to trace them back to their source. Back here." Jester understood with crystalline clarity that his clever misdirection had backfired catastrophically. Instead of chasing shadows in distant valleys, Hartwell had used the promise of convergent mineral veins to justify a systematic excavation campaign, working his way methodically toward the true prize. The man's scholarly patience had proven more dangerous than crude greed. The cabin's walls began to hum, not with the warm resonance of living wood, but with something approaching a war cry. Every board, every beam, every lovingly fitted joint vibrated in harmony with the mountain's mounting outrage. Outside, Jester could hear trees creaking ominously as their root systems responded to some unspoken command from deep below. "Boy, you need to get outside. Now!" Jester stumbled toward the door, but before he could reach it, the cabin's interior suddenly blazed with light. Not the gentle phosphorescence he'd witnessed before, but harsh geometric patterns that burned themselves into his retinas. The ghostly blueprints on every surface weren't showing building plans anymore. They were showing battle formations. The mountain was preparing to defend itself, and in its rage, it was forgetting the difference between allies and enemies. Jester felt the cabin floor begin to buckle beneath his feet as root systems the size of railway tunnels shifted deep underground. Through the windows, he watched in fascinated horror as the entire mountainside began to reshape itself. Rock slides cascaded down distant slopes in perfectly controlled patterns, while new springs burst from solid stone to flood the valleys where excavation equipment labored. But the most terrifying change was happening inside his own mind. The mountain's consciousness, so vast and patient during their gentle communions, was now pressing against his thoughts with crushing force. He could feel its alien intelligence trying to subsume his own, to transform him from an interpreter into an instrument of its vengeance. "Fight it!" Whitmore's voice cut through the psychic maelstrom. "Don't let it consume you. Remember who you are." Jester gritted his teeth and forced himself to stand against the overwhelming pressure. This was the final test, not just his ability to serve as the mountain's voice, but his strength to remain himself while channeling something infinitely larger and more powerful. Another explosion echoed from the eastern ridges, and the mountain's fury spiked like molten iron in his veins. For a moment, Jester felt his own identity fragmenting under the assault of alien emotions. He was 9 years old and ancient beyond measure, abandoned and eternal, human and geological simultaneously. But in that moment of dissolution, he found his anchor, the memory of Thomas Whitmore's patient teaching, the gentle guidance that had shown him carpentry not as dominance over wood, but as partnership with it. The mountain wasn't trying to destroy him. It was drowning in its own rage and reaching desperately for something human-sized to hold on to. "I know you're angry," Jester gasped, pressing both palms against the blazing walls. "They hurt you. They're still hurting you. But this isn't the way. This isn't who you are." The pressure in his skull intensified, and for a terrifying moment he thought he might be crushed entirely. Then, gradually, the mountain's fury began to transform into something else, not the cold patience he'd experienced before, but a deep, aching loneliness that had been growing for millennia. The ancient consciousness had been dreaming alone for so long that it had forgotten how to be gentle with something as fragile as human awareness. It wasn't trying to consume him, it was trying to hold on to the first real companionship it had known since the last ice age. Understanding flooded through Jester like warm honey. The mountain needed him not just as a voice, but as a teacher, someone to show it how to interact with the quick, bright lives that flickered across its surface, without crushing them in the process. The final test wasn't about power, it was about compassion. The revelation hit Jester like lightning splitting stone. The mountain's greatest enemy wasn't the men with their dynamite and drilling equipment. It was its own crushing loneliness, its inability to connect without destroying. For eons, it had watched civilizations rise and fall across its slopes like morning frost, beautiful and brief and forever beyond its reach. "You don't have to be alone anymore," Jester whispered, his voice barely audible above the chaos erupting outside. "But you have to learn to be gentle." The blazing patterns on the walls flickered, and he felt the ancient consciousness pause in its terrible awakening. Through the psychic link, Jester shared his own memories, not the recent trauma of abandonment, but older, deeper recollections. His mother's hands teaching him to whittle, showing him how wood wanted to be shaped, the careful patience required to coax a flame from wet kindling, the delicate balance between strength and tenderness that all living things required to thrive. The mountain's rage wavered, confused by these alien concepts. In its vast experience, interaction meant pressure. The slow crush of tectonic forces, the grinding transformation of stone into sand. It knew power but had forgotten finesse, forgotten that some bonds were strengthened not by force but by restraint. Another explosion thundered from the eastern peaks, and Jester felt the mountain's fury spike again. But this time, he was ready for it. Instead of fighting the overwhelming emotions, he embraced them, letting the ancient pain flow through him while maintaining his own core of human understanding. "Yes, they're hurting you," he acknowledged, his hands burning against the cabin walls. "But if you destroy them, others will come. More men, with bigger machines, with armies if they have to. They'll never stop until they understand what you are. Then what choice do I have?" The mountain's voice in his mind was no longer Whitmore's gentle whisper. It was the grinding of continental plates, the slow roar of geological time made audible. "You choose to trust me," Jester said simply, "like you trusted Thomas. Let me be your voice, your interpreter. Let me teach them how to see you as something more than a resource to be exploited." The cabin shuddered as another blast echoed across the valley, but this time the mountain's response was different. Instead of unleashing its full fury, the ancient consciousness pulled back, observing through Jester's human senses. For the first time in millennia, it was trying to understand rather than simply react. Through the eastern window, Jester could see tiny figures moving on the distant ridges, Hartwell's survey teams methodically following the mineral traces that would inevitably lead them here. They were close now, perhaps a day's excavation, from discovering the true source of the mountain's power. But as Jester watched, he realized that the confrontation he'd been dreading was already over. The real battle hadn't been between human greed and ancient wisdom. It had been between isolation and connection, between the fear of being hurt and the courage to remain open despite that risk. The mountain had chosen trust. The blazing patterns on the cabin walls began to fade, transforming back into the gentle phosphorescence that had first guided Jester to safety. But now he could read them differently, understanding that they weren't just blueprints or warnings, they were the mountain's attempt at communication, its first faltering words in a language that could bridge the gap between stone time and human time. What happens now? Whitmore's presence had returned to its familiar gentleness, no longer distorted by the mountain's rage. Jester moved to the eastern window, watching the distant excavation work with new eyes. "Now I do what the mountain chose me to do. I go down there and teach them how to listen instead of just taking. It would be dangerous." These men had invested too much money and pride to simply abandon their claims based on the word of a 9-year-old boy. But Jester was no longer just a frightened child surviving in the wilderness. He carried within himself the patience of stone, the wisdom of roots, and the accumulated love of everyone who had ever tried to build something beautiful from raw materials. The cabin door swung open at his touch, and morning sunlight streamed across the threshold. Behind him, the walls hummed with quiet approval, not the war song of moments before, but something like a benediction. The mountain was still afraid, still angry at the violence being done to its neighboring peaks, but it was no longer alone with those feelings. As Jester stepped outside, he felt the entire network of ancient consciousnesses watching through his eyes, learning from his example. Other peaks across the range were stirring not with rage now, but with cautious hope. Perhaps the age of sleeping mountains was ending. Perhaps it was time for the old earth to find its voice again. The confrontation was over, but the real work, the delicate, patient task of teaching two different forms of consciousness how to coexist, was just beginning. The sacrifice. Jester's boots crunched through frost as he descended the mountain path, each step carrying him away from everything that had become precious to him. The cabin's warm glow faded behind him, and with it, the constant comfort of Whitmore's presence. For the first time in weeks, he felt truly alone. "You don't have to do this, boy," Whitmore's voice whispered faintly, already growing distant as the spiritual bond between them stretched. "There might be another way." Jester knew better. He had felt the mountain's consciousness probing the excavation sites, had sensed its growing desperation as the drilling equipment crept closer to its heart. Hartwell's teams were less than a day from breaking through to the main chamber, the sacred space where mineral veins converged in patterns that would reveal the mountain's true nature to anyone with eyes to see. The price of preventing that discovery was becoming clear with each downward step. To serve as the mountain's voice among men, he would have to leave behind the only home he had ever truly known. The cabin that had sheltered him, taught him, transformed him from an abandoned child into something far more significant. It would have to remain empty while he ventured into the dangerous territory of human ambition. "I understand," he said aloud, though his voice caught on the words. The mountain's consciousness pressed gently against his mind, offering what comfort it could, but both of them knew the sacrifice was necessary. As the sun climbed higher, Jester reached the edge of Hartwell's excavation camp. Men swarmed over the rocky slopes like industrious ants, their drilling equipment sending vibrations deep into stone that made the mountain flinch with each impact. Steam engines chugged and wheezed, their black smoke staining the pristine morning air. Dr. Hartwell stood at the center of the operation, studying geological charts with the focused intensity of a general planning an assault. When he looked up and saw Jester approaching, his eyes widened with recognition and something approaching hunger. "The boy from the cabin," he called out, striding forward with barely contained excitement. "Perfect timing. We're on the verge of a breakthrough that will revolutionize our understanding of mineral formation. Your little construction project up there was just the beginning." Jester felt the mountain's consciousness recoil at the man's words, its ancient patience finally reaching its limit. Through their bond, he sensed other peaks across the range beginning to stir, not with curiosity now, but with protective fury. If he failed here, if he couldn't find a way to make these men understand, the mountain's retaliation would make the previous night's tremors seem like gentle rainfall. "You have to stop," Jester said simply, his child's voice carrying an authority that made several workers pause in their labor. "You're hurting something that's older and more important than any treasure you might find." Hartwell's smile was patronizing, tinged with the cruel amusement of an adult dismissing a child's fantasy. "My dear boy, I understand you formed an emotional attachment to this place, but we're conducting serious scientific research here. The mineral formations we're tracking represent a geological phenomenon that could destroy everything you're trying to study," Jester interrupted, stepping closer to the drilling site. The mountain's pain flowed through him like molten lead as the machinery bit deeper into stone. "There's a consciousness here, Dr. Hartwell, something alive in ways you don't understand, and it's running out of patience with your excavations." The scholar's expression shifted from amusement to calculating interest. "Consciousness? Are you claiming some form of supernatural intelligence guides these formations? How fascinating. If that were true, think of what we could learn by bringing it into controlled laboratory conditions." The words hit Jester like physical blows. This was exactly what the mountain feared most, not just exploitation, but imprisonment. He thought of the gentle warmth in the cabin walls, the patient teachings that had shaped both his carpentry skills and his understanding of partnership with living things. All of it reduced to specimens in Hartwell's sterile research facility. "You can't cage a mountain," Jester said quietly, but his words carried the rumbling undertone of settling stone. Several workers stepped back nervously as the ground beneath their feet began to vibrate. "Any more than you could bottle the sky or chain the wind." Hartwell's eyes gleamed with scientific fervor. "But think of the applications, boy. If we could understand how consciousness interfaces with geological processes, we could revolutionize everything from mining to architecture. The implications for..." The drilling equipment suddenly seized with a grinding shriek of metal, and every worker in the camp felt the mountain shift beneath them like a sleeping giant turning in its dreams. But Jester felt something far more profound, the ancient consciousness pulling back from their connection, not in rejection, but in a desperate attempt to protect him from what was coming. The mountain was preparing to defend itself, and it was willing to sever their bond to keep Jester safe from the consequences. "No," he whispered, pressing his hands against the rocky ground. "We do this together, or not at all." The choice was made. The sacrifice was complete. The moment Jester's palms touched stone, the severed connection blazed back to life with such intensity that he gasped, his small body becoming a conduit for the mountain's accumulated centuries of patient endurance. But instead of the crushing fury he expected, what flowed through him was something else entirely, a deep, resonant calm that seemed to expand outward from their joined consciousness like ripples in still water. The drilling equipment didn't explode. The ground didn't crack open to swallow Hartwell's camp. Instead, every piece of machinery simply stopped, not broken, not destroyed, but somehow convinced that continuing would be inadvisable. Steam engines wheezed to silence. Metal drill bits withdrew from stone with the reluctant whisper of lovers parting. Even the men themselves felt compelled to step back from their work, though none could articulate exactly why. Dr. Hartwell stared in fascination as geological charts began rewriting themselves in his hands, not with new mineral formations, but with something that looked disturbingly like topographical poetry. Mathematical equations transformed into flowing scripts that described the patient dreams of sleeping ridges, the slow conversations conducted through root systems and underground streams. "Impossible," he breathed, but his voice carried wonder instead of denial. Jester felt the mountain's consciousness settling around the excavation site like morning mist, neither threatening nor retreating but simply present, making itself known with the gentle insistence of sunlight through clouds. For the first time in millennia, the ancient intelligence wasn't trying to hide from human awareness, it was introducing itself. Workers throughout the camp found their tools growing warm in their hands, not uncomfortably so, but with the same welcoming heat that radiated from a well-tended hearth. Shovels and pickaxes began to feel less like instruments of violence and more like extensions of their own bodies, responsive and almost eager to be used for construction rather than excavation. "It's offering partnership," Jester realized aloud, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly hushed camp. "Not trying to stop your work, Dr. Hartwell, trying to redirect it." The scholar's geological charts continued their metamorphosis, revealing mineral formations arranged not in random clusters, but in deliberate patterns, blueprints for structures that would work with the mountain's natural architecture instead of against it, foundations that would strengthen stone rather than fracture it, supports that would channel the mountain's own deep currents to power whatever facilities they chose to build. Hartwell's hands trembled as understanding dawned. These formations, they're not accidental. Something's been designing them for 50 years, Jester confirmed, thinking of Thomas Whitmore's patient planning, waiting for people who could see building as collaboration instead of conquest. Around the camp, workers were discovering that their equipment had been subtly transformed. Drilling mechanisms now responded to the mountain's guidance, boring test holes that revealed mineral veins arranged in precise geometric patterns. Steam engines ran smoother and quieter when their operators listened to the rhythm of underground streams. Even the harsh industrial smoke began to dissipate as if drawn away by considerate breezes. The ancient consciousness pressed gently against Jester's awareness, sharing images of the future it envisioned, research facilities built into cliff faces that would strengthen rather than weaken the stone, laboratories powered by geothermal springs that had waited eons for someone to discover their purpose, mining operations that would harvest what the mountain freely offered while leaving its deeper mysteries intact. Dr. Hartwell dropped his transformed charts and stared directly at Jester, his scholarly arrogance replaced by something approaching reverence. The consciousness you described, it's real, and it's been planning this, preparing for our arrival. Preparing for the right arrival, Jester corrected gently. People who could understand partnership, instead of just taking what they wanted. The mountain's presence grew stronger around them, and suddenly every person in the camp could feel it. Not as an alien intelligence to be feared or studied, but as a patient teacher offering to share knowledge accumulated across geological ages. The overwhelming sense of ancient wisdom was tempered by something unmistakably benevolent, like being welcomed into the home of the world's most understanding grandfather. Workers began to smile without knowing why. Equipment that had seemed crude and violent moments before now felt like precision instruments in the hands of master craftsmen. The harsh angles of industrial machinery softened as if reshaping themselves to complement the mountain's natural curves. "What happens now?" Hartwell asked, his voice subdued by wonder. Jester felt the mountain's contentment flowing through their bond, not the desperate relief of a crisis averted, but the deep satisfaction of a long-held dream finally coming to fruition. The sacrifice had been completed, but not in the way any of them had expected. Instead of choosing between human ambition and natural preservation, they had discovered the possibility of synthesis. "Now we build," Jester said simply, gesturing toward the transformed camp where men and machinery worked in newfound harmony with stone and stream. "We build something that's never been tried before." The mountain's ancient patience had found its perfect expression at last, not in solitary dreaming, but in collaborative creation that honored both the quick, bright urgency of human innovation and the deep, slow wisdom of geological time. The resolution was complete. The real work was just beginning. The return. 3 months later, Jester stood at the threshold of his transformed cabin, watching the last of the autumn snow melt from the eaves. The structure around him hummed with quiet satisfaction. Not just the familiar warmth of Whitmore's presence, but something deeper. The mountain's consciousness flowed through every beam and board, turning his small shelter into a bridge between two worlds. "You've changed, boy." Whitmore's voice carried gentle amusement as Jester packed his few belongings into a leather satchel Dr. Hartwell had given him. "When I first found you shivering in my doorway, I never imagined." "Neither did I," Jester admitted, running his fingers along the cabin walls one final time. The phosphorescent patterns beneath his touch had evolved over the past months, no longer just blueprints, but living communications that shifted and flowed like written music. But it's time. The experimental facility taking shape in the valley below represented everything they had worked toward. A research station built into the mountain's natural caves, powered by carefully channeled geothermal springs designed to study geological processes without disrupting them. More importantly, it was staffed by people who had learned to listen to stone before trying to break it. Dr. Hartwell's transformation had been the most dramatic. The ambitious scholar who had arrived with drilling equipment and explosive charges now spent his days learning to read the mountain's mineral script, documenting a form of intelligence that had been shaping geological formations for millennia. His published papers were causing revolutions in both scientific and philosophical circles, describing consciousness that operated on geological timescales and thought in terms of continental drift rather than human urgency. But Jester knew his own changes ran deeper than anything visible in the valley. The frightened 8-year-old who had stumbled into this cabin during a December blizzard was gone, replaced by someone who carried the patience of mountains and the accumulated wisdom of partnership with forces far greater than human ambition. He moved differently now, spoke with quiet authority that made adults pause and consider his words seriously. The town of Cedar Falls, when he finally returned to it, felt like a place from someone else's childhood. Streets that had once seemed impossibly wide now appeared narrow and confining. Buildings that had towered over his young perspective looked fragile, temporary things that might blow away in the next strong wind. The people were the hardest adjustment of all. Mrs. Patterson from the general store barely recognized him when he walked through her door, his back straight and his eyes holding depths that seemed impossible in someone not yet 10 years old. Sheriff Morrison, who had given up searching for him after the first blizzard, stared as if seeing a ghost when Jester calmly explained where he had been and what he had learned. "You can't have survived a winter up there alone, boy," Morrison said, his voice uncertain. "Grown men have died on those slopes with full supplies and experience. There's no way a child could—" "I wasn't alone," Jester replied simply, and something in his tone prevented further questions. The real reunion he had dreaded came 3 weeks after his return. His father, drunk and belligerent as always, showed up at the boarding house where Jester had taken a room. The man who had abandoned him to freeze in the mountains stood swaying in the doorway, demanding explanations and making threats about ungrateful children who had caused him trouble. But when their eyes met, something unexpected happened. Jester felt no fear, no anger, no desperate need for approval or affection. The mountain's deep patience flowed through him, ancient and imperturbable, and suddenly his father seemed smaller, more fragile than threatening. A broken man whose cruelty came from his own terror of being powerless in a world he couldn't understand or control. "I forgive you," Jester said quietly, and meant it completely. His father's bluster collapsed like punctured bellows. For a moment, the man's face showed confusion, then something that might have been relief, before he turned and stumbled away. Jester never saw him again, but somehow he knew the encounter had freed them both from chains that had bound 3 generations. The letters from the research facility arrived weekly, filled with discoveries that validated everything Jester had tried to explain. Mountain consciousnesses across the range were awakening from their long isolation, cautiously making contact with human researchers who had learned to approach them as partners rather than subjects. Ancient mineral formations were revealing themselves as deliberately constructed architectures. Underground streams sang with purposeful harmonies that suggested geological symphonies composed across millions of years. Dr. Hartwell's most recent letter included an invitation that made Jester smile. The facility needed a liaison, someone who could translate between human urgency and geological time, between scientific curiosity and ancient wisdom. Someone young enough to grow into the role, with enough natural ability to bridge worlds that had been separate too long. The mountain called to him through stone foundations and underground connections, reminding him that true partnership required presence, patience, and the willingness to build something entirely new from the synthesis of different forms of consciousness. Jester folded the letter carefully and began planning his return to the high peaks, where he had learned who he truly was. The new beginning. The journey back to the mountains felt different this time. Not the desperate flight of a frightened child, but the purposeful return of someone who had found his calling. Jester rode the supply wagon up the winding trail with workers and scientists heading to the facility, but his eyes remained fixed on the distant peaks where ancient consciousness waited with the patience of geological ages. Spring had transformed the landscape he remembered from winter's harsh grip. Wildflowers carpeted meadows where he had once struggled through knee-deep snow, and streams sang with melted runoff that carried messages from peak to peak in harmonies only he could fully understand. The mountain's presence grew stronger with each mile, welcoming him home with the warmth of recognition. The research facility sprawled across a natural amphitheater of stone, its buildings integrated so seamlessly with cliff faces and cave systems that they seemed to have grown rather than been constructed. Steam rose from carefully channeled hot springs that powered the generators, while laboratories nestled into caverns whose walls phosphoresced with the same gentle light Jester remembered from Whitmore's cabin. Dr. Hartwell met him at the main entrance, the scholar's appearance transformed by months of collaboration with forces beyond human comprehension. The ambitious gleam in his eyes had been replaced by something deeper, the quiet satisfaction of someone who had learned to ask better questions rather than demanding immediate answers. "Welcome back, Jester," Hartwell said, extending his hand in greeting. "We've been preparing your workspace according to your specifications. The mountain has been helpful in guiding the construction. The liaison office they showed him occupied a natural alcove carved into living rock, its windows offering panoramic views of the valley while its walls hummed with the familiar presence of ancient intelligence. A desk, crafted from salvaged cabin lumber, sat beneath charts that shifted and evolved as the mountain shared new insights about mineral formations and underground water systems. But it was the smaller room adjacent to his office that made Jester's breath catch. There, preserved exactly as he remembered, stood Thomas Whitmore's original workbench, complete with the phantom blueprints that had guided their winter collaboration. The tools lay arranged precisely as the old prospector had left them, still warm to the touch and eager for skilled hands to put them to proper use. "Thought you might appreciate having the familiar around." Whitmore's voice carried gentle amusement through the stone walls. "This new work we're doing, it's going to need all the patience and precision we can manage." Jester ran his fingers along the worn handle of Whitmore's favorite chisel, feeling the connection that linked past and present, individual ambition and collaborative creation. Through the tool's familiar weight, he sensed other presences stirring, mountain consciousnesses across the entire range, slowly awakening from their ancient isolation, cautiously reaching out to researchers who had proven they could be trusted with geological secrets. The weeks that followed established rhythms unlike anything the scientific world had ever seen. Jester's days began before dawn, sitting in meditation with the mountain's consciousness to understand which mineral formations were ready to reveal their secrets, which underground systems needed protection from human interference. His mornings were spent translating these insights for research teams, helping them design experiments that would gather knowledge without causing damage. Afternoons found him in the workshop, using Whitmore's tools to craft instruments that bridged the gap between human curiosity and geological patience, measuring devices that could detect the subtle vibrations of stone-to-stone communication, drilling equipment that followed mineral veins rather than forcing paths through them, communication arrays that translated the mountain's slow thoughts into frequencies human minds could process. But the evenings were his favorite time. As sunset painted the peaks in shades of gold and crimson, Jester would climb to the facility's highest observation deck and simply listen. The mountain's voices carried on wind and water, sharing discoveries that spanned continents and eons. Ancient intelligences that had dreamed in isolation for millennia were learning to collaborate, their combined wisdom creating possibilities no single consciousness could achieve alone. Letters arrived regularly from around the world, reports of similar partnerships emerging between human researchers and geological entities that had previously remained hidden. The revolution they had begun in these Montana peaks was spreading, transforming humanity's understanding of consciousness itself. Intelligence, it seemed, was not limited to biological forms, but could emerge from any system complex and patient enough to sustain it. One evening, as winter's first snow began to dust the peaks, Jester found himself thinking of the frightened child who had stumbled into Whitmore's cabin nearly 2 years ago. That boy seemed like a distant memory now, though every lesson learned during those desperate months remained vivid and essential. The carpentry skills, the patience, the willingness to trust in partnerships beyond human understanding, all of it had led to this moment. The mountain's presence settled around him like a familiar embrace, ancient and eternal, yet somehow made new by their collaboration. Through their bond, he felt the deep satisfaction of dreams finally made manifest, not just Whitmore's vision of revolutionary mining, but something far grander, a future where human ambition and geological wisdom could build wonders neither could achieve alone. Jester smiled and began planning tomorrow's work. The real construction was just beginning.